Hello everyone, and welcome to a review of Battleground, Book 17 of the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. I've been a longtime fan of the Dresden Files for the past 5 years, so while I'll attempt to be as impartial as I can be, do expect there to be some bias. You kind of need some bias when judging a book this far in the series anyways, since most of the payoffs in this book are seriously reliant on how invested you are in the characters as a whole. Still, that's not going to stop me from talking about this book's overall style and prose, which are things I can be a little more objective about. Before we get started, I will say that I read this book immediately after Peace Talks, which is book 16 of this long-running series. And coming from that book right into this one, it feels very much like the two books could have been one book as a whole, as Battleground is very reliant on the setup from Peace Talks to make its action-packed, rapid-fire pace make sense. So, if you plan on picking this book up, I recommend reading or rereading Peace Talks first, as it will make this experience much better overall. For those of you just jumping into the series, well, I wouldn't recommend that you start here. This being book 17 means there's going to be a lot of things mentioned in this book that many readers should have prior knowledge of, and newcomers will definitely feel lost due to this. If you want to get into the Dresden Files, start from book 1, as I can't recommend a better urban fantasy series out there. Battleground represents a culmination of the threads that have been laid out through the entire series, and to read this book first without experiencing those would be doing yourself a great disservice. Now, on to the review. Starting off with style, the Dresden Files has never been a series filled with flowery language and verbose prose. Much like the world it portrays, this series has always held a grittier, blunt feel, and Battleground continues this trend as we experience the events of the book through the eyes of the titular main character, Harry Dresden. Butcher, through Dresden, exhibits a very raw prose, filled with descriptions that fit the mentality of the book's main character, but are also effective enough to form a clear picture within the mind of the reader as well. This style has always made the Dresden Files not only easy to read, but effective in making the reader empathize with its protagonist. We feel everything that Dresden feels, laid out bare with very little filter. And with that style, Butcher manages to make his emotional moments stick with you long enough to make the next climactic moment all the more effective. With that being said, I do have some issue with how snarky the descriptions and the dialogue can be. While I wouldn't call it Marvel levels of snark, there is enough of it, especially in this book, that clashes with some of the very emotional moments to take me out of it. When seen as a coping mechanism on Dresden's part, it makes sense, but part of me wanted to see the emotional events within this book stick a bit longer before the snark came rolling back out, especially since there are many things that happen that, quite frankly, would make anyone lose their humor. Beyond its raw but effective style of prose, the Dresden Files has always been a series that portrays its action in a very grounded but exhilarating way. Yes, there is a fantastical element given the series' subject matter, but when the action occurs, the descriptions of what's happening are realistic, which makes it all feel very believable. Dresden may be able to shoot fireballs and create walls of ice, but when he gets hit in the face, rather than shrugging it off like it's no big deal, he feels it, usually to the point where it represents a shift in power. Every blow, every spell in the Dresden Files has an impact and purpose, with nothing feeling wasted or overblown. And Battleground continues this trend, but there are a few caveats. This book is dense with action, from beginning to end, and while the usual grounded but fantastical portrayals of action are present, there are a few moments within the book where the action goes by in a blur and descriptions start to get unclear. During these moments, the details don't hit as hard as they're supposed to, and I found myself sometimes rereading paragraphs to get a sense of what was going on. Overall, it wasn't enough to pull me out of the world, but it was noticeable enough at a few points that I felt it was necessary to mention it. Moving on to the plot, without spoilers, I will say that this book is one of payoffs, with little time spent towards developing characters. That is not a negative, as, being the 17th book in a long-running series, much of the character development leading to these moments has already been done in books prior to this one. For all the adrenaline-pumping action within the book, by the time of the novel's conclusion, it feels as if things have settled down as opposed to shaken up, though there is plenty that happens within the book that either changes the dynamic of the series entirely or provides new plot threads to explore in later books. I can't speak too much on this without providing spoilers, but I will say by the time of the novel's conclusion, you will feel out of breath at the amount of things that did happen, and it will leave longtime fans of the series feeling very bittersweet, and this includes the small short story written at the end of the book. As I mentioned before, the Dresden Files has always provided a very unfiltered window into the emotions and thoughts of its protagonist, but Battleground manages to expand on this into a much more significant degree. Harry is in a dark place at the time of this book, and this book's setting and events reflect that. However, what Butcher does well is provide enough of a light, enough hope within Harry that the more dour tones of the series don't feel oppressive to the point that reading the book feels like a slog. Where there are moments of despair and tragedy, there are also moments of levity and hope that balance it out. This is especially true for the climax of this book, which was such an emotional roller coaster that I felt lightheaded by the time it was done. To that end, however, those of you looking for a smaller scale adventure akin to the majority of the Dresden Files books will not find it here. This is the most bombastic and large scale the series has ever been, that leaves little time to dwell on things, and that may be a bit jarring for those that are used to the usual ebb and flow of the Dresden Files. However, there is a significant amount of time at the end that does allow the floodgates of emotion to open and for those things to start sinking in, but until then events are passed over at rapid fire rates. The events that happen in this book would, in a typical Dresden Files book, spend much more time making sure the gravity of the situation settled before moving on, but Battleground opts to instead keep moving and let those moments come towards the end. As a result, some of the emotional moments that do happen don't feel as effective as they should be, and there are a few things that do happen that feel more like that they were there to service the plot rather than be consistent with the world and its characters. Now, before I give my overall thoughts of the book, I want to take a moment to appreciate the world building present within the Dresden Files as a whole. That aspect of the series has always been solid, and that trend continues within this book. Threads are laid out for future stories without being intrusive to the current plot, and the book pays respects to a large amount of mythological stories, blending them together in such a way that it all feels organic and respectful to the original sources. It's this amount of care put into the world that has made the Dresden Files such a joy to read, and I'm glad Butcher has managed to keep it up for so long. So, to sum everything up, Battleground is a great continuation of the Dresden Files, but it trades its usual slower-paced, character-driven plot for something that is more action-packed and climactic, resulting in an exhilarating, adrenaline-pumping storyline that keeps you engrossed to the point that I honestly recommend reading this book in one sitting. Payoffs to previous story threads come in spades here, and the novel also manages to lay out a web of other stories to be explored in the future. However, the book's action-focused plot is both a blessing and a curse, as some of the action can fade into a blur at times, and some very emotional moments aren't given much time to sink in until the end of the book, which can make the book's tone feel very jarring at times. Again, if you're new to the series, I definitely do not recommend that you start here, as there are a ton of details here you will not understand. But for longtime fans of the series, definitely pick this up. As an aside, the additional short story at the end is a nice, sweet cherry on top of it all, and I definitely recommend reading that right after finishing the book. For those of you that want a more spoiler-focused discussion of this book, I'll be recording a podcast with a buddy of mine who's been reading the series way longer than I have, and we both have, some thoughts about what happened. But in the meantime, thank you everyone for listening to this review, and I wish all of you a very pleasant day.